I'm Amanda, and for 32 years, I thought I knew the man I married, Richard, my rock, my rough-edged mechanic who always came home smelling of oil and grit. But lately, the silence in our small Ohio home has grown heavier, the cracks in our life splitting wider with every late-night excuse and sharp word. I've felt a gnawing emptiness, a betrayal I couldn't name, until a crumpled receipt and a hidden note shattered everything I believed about us. Now I'm standing at the edge of a truth so dark it could unravel everything. Will I confront the lies, or will they consume me first? Picture this: a faint hum of crickets outside my window on a still Ohio night, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. I'm Amanda, 58 years old, sitting in my modest suburban home in a town so small you'd miss it if you blinked. My life, on the surface, is as plain as the beige walls of this house. 32 years married to Richard, a 60-year-old mechanic with hands rougher than sandpaper and a heart I always believed was steady, even if his edges were sharp. I've spent decades smoothing those edges, being the wife everyone expects, part-time receptionist at the local dentist's office, always with a smile for the patients, while Richard grinds away long hours at his garage, coming home smelling of oil and exhaustion. Our two kids, Emily, 30, and Mark, 28, have long since flown the nest, building their own lives far from this quiet street. Their absence echoes in the empty bedrooms upstairs, in the way the house creaks with nothing to fill the silence. I've always played my part well. Dinners on the table, bills paid on time, a calm voice when Richard's temper sparked like a faulty wire. Money's been tight more times than I can count, but I've held it together, piecing our life into something that looked whole, even if the seams were fraying. Lately, though, there's this hollow ache inside me, a void I can't name. It's like I've misplaced a piece of who I used to be, somewhere between the laundry and the late-night arguments. I remember one evening not long ago, sitting alone at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee in my hand, staring at the chipped edge of the table as if it held some kind of answer. That hollow feeling has only grown in the weeks since, gnawing at me with every passing day. Something's off with Richard, and I can't ignore it anymore. He's always been a man of few words, but lately he's a locked door I can't find the key to. He's been coming home later and later from the garage, sometimes well past midnight, his boots dragging across the floor like he's carrying the weight of the world. When I ask how his day was, he barely looks at me, just grunts something vague and heads straight for the shower. And the way he snaps over the smallest things, it's like I'm walking on eggshells. Last week, I forgot to pick up his favorite dark roast, and he bit my head off saying I never pay attention to what matters. His words stung more than I let on, but I just nodded and apologized, like always. Then there was the receipt. I was doing laundry, pulling his jacket out of the hamper, when a crumpled piece of paper fell from the pocket. I smoothed it out, curious, and saw it was a bar tab for $200, dated just a few nights before. My stomach twisted. Richard hadn't said a word about going out, not with friends, not with anyone. When I held it up and asked him about it, his face tightened for a split second before he forced a laugh, saying it was just a work thing. But that laugh, it was shaky, like a cracked window about to shatter. I wanted to push, to demand more, but I didn't. I just let it sit there, that unanswered question burning a hole in my mind. But that bar tab was just the beginning, a tiny crack in the dam that was about to burst wide open. It was a rainy afternoon a few days later, the kind of gray, dreary day that makes you feel trapped inside your own thoughts. Richard was at the garage, or so he said, and I found myself pacing our quiet house, that hollow ache gnawing deeper. I don't know what possessed me, but I ended up in the basement, standing in front of his desk, a cluttered mess of tools, receipts, and old coffee mugs. I'd never snooped through his things before, not in all our 32 years together, but that day my hands moved on their own, trembling as I opened drawers and rifled through papers. I felt like a thief in my own home, my heart pounding so loud I swore it echoed off the damp concrete walls. Then I found it. Tucked inside a faded envelope buried under a stack of bills was a handwritten note. The scrawl was messy, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. It was from someone named Carl, demanding payment of $5,800 by the end of the month for what he called a personal loan. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. $5,800. How could we owe that much without me knowing a single thing about it? I stood there, frozen, the paper shaking in my hands, my mind racing with questions. How long had Richard been hiding this? What else didn't I know? Anger surged through me, hot and bitter, as I paced the basement, the cold air doing nothing to cool the fire in my chest. I'd spent decades trusting him, balancing our tight budget, scraping by. How could he keep something this huge from me? But the real blow came later that evening. I waited for him, the note clutched in my hand like a weapon. When Richard finally walked through the door, the kitchen light casting harsh shadows on his tired face, I was ready. I stood by the counter, my voice trembling as I held up the note and demanded to know what it meant. After that gut-wrenching showdown with Richard in the kitchen, where the truth about his debts and the twisted deal he'd made spilled out like poison, I couldn't stay in that house another second. I grabbed my keys, my hands trembling so bad I could barely hold them, and stumbled out into the rain. My old sedan coughed to life as I slid into the driver's seat, the cold leather biting through my thin sweater. I didn't have a destination in mind, just needed to move, to escape the suffocating weight of his words still ringing in my ears. The rain hammered the windshield, blurring the world outside into streaks of gray and shadow, mirroring the chaos in my head. My knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, shaking not just from the chill, but from the raw, jagged hurt tearing through me. I drove aimlessly through the empty streets of our little town, past the familiar gas station, the shuttered hardware store, every turn a reminder of the life I'd built, now crumbling. Hours slipped by, or maybe it was minutes. Time felt like a warped, slippery thing. Eventually, I found myself pulling into the gravel lot of a rundown diner on the edge of town, the neon sign flickering like a dying star. I slid into a booth in the corner, the vinyl sticky under my palms, and ordered a coffee I didn't even want. It sat there, cold and untouched, while I stared into the black liquid like it might hold some kind of answer. Richard's confession played on a loop in my mind. How he'd bartered me, my dignity, as if I were nothing more than a tool to settle his mess with Carl and Vince. Me, his wife of 32 years, reduced to a transaction. My chest ached with the betrayal, a deep, hollow pain that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. Who was I if not the woman who held it all together? Who was I if I'd let myself be stripped down to nothing but a bargaining chip? I caught my reflection in the diner window, the rain streaking down the glass like tears on my own face. The lines etched deep around my eyes, the exhaustion weighing down my shoulders. They stared back at me, a woman I barely recognized. My mind was a storm, but somewhere in that chaos, a decision crystallized. I couldn't go back to the life I'd known, not after everything Richard had shattered. So I left the diner, the bell above the door jingling faintly behind me, and drove straight to the motel on the outskirts of town, the place Richard had mentioned in his confession, where Carl and Vince were waiting. My breath came shallow, hitching in my chest, as I stood outside the chipped paint of room 12, the faint buzz of the neon sign above casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. I raised my fist, hesitating for just a heartbeat before knocking, the sound sharp against the quiet night. The door creaked open, and there stood Carl, a burly man in his late 50s, his frame filling the doorway. His gravelly voice rasped out a surprised, "Amanda?" as his weathered face broke into a pleased, almost knowing smirk. Behind him, Vince, a wiry man in his early 60s, sat on the edge of a sagging bed, his sharp eyes studying me with quiet curiosity, like he was trying to read my intentions before I even spoke. I stepped inside, the air thick with the stale scent of cheap cologne and cigarette smoke, the flickering neon light seeping through the thin, tattered curtains. Tension hung heavy, an unspoken weight pressing down as I stood there, my hands fidgeting at my sides. Carl shut the door with a soft thud, and the room seemed to shrink around us. He started to speak, his rough voice cutting through the silence, mentioning the arrangement Richard had made, laying out the terms as if I were just another piece of the deal. But I couldn't let him finish. My voice, steady for the first time that night, sliced through his words like a blade. I'm not here because of Richard. I'm here because I choose to be. Their expressions froze, stunned, like I'd flipped some invisible script they'd been following. Carl's bushy brows lifted, then lowered as he gave a slow nod, a glint of understanding in his eyes. That moment in the motel room marked a turning point, a line I crossed not out of obligation, but out of a desperate need to reclaim something for myself. What unfolded there with Carl and Vince isn't something I'll spell out in plain words, but let's just say it was a raw, unspoken exchange of power and choice. A moment where I took back control in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was messy, intense, and left me feeling both shattered and strangely whole, like I'd pieced together a part of me I'd long buried. Hours later, I drove back through the quiet streets, the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. My hands still trembled on the steering wheel, but it wasn't just from the cold anymore. It was the weight of what I'd done, what I'd chosen. When I pulled into the driveway of our tired old house, the familiar creak of the porch swing greeted me like a ghost of the life I was about to leave behind. I stepped inside, the air heavy with the scent of stale coffee, and there was Richard, slumped at the kitchen table. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with exhaustion, a half-empty bottle of whiskey sitting in front of him like a silent confession. He looked up as I entered, his face a storm of emotions, confusion, anger, and something like fear. "Where the hell have you been, Amanda?" His voice cracked, sharp and raw, as he pushed himself up from the chair, the bottle clinking against the table. I stood there, my coat still damp from the night's rain, and met his gaze with a calm I didn't know I had. "I was with Carl and Vince," I said, each word deliberate, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Not because of your deal, Richard, because I wanted to be." His face froze, then twisted into something between shock and pain, like I'd struck him. He staggered back a step, his hands gripping the edge of the table for support. What are you saying?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I took a "don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment if you enjoyed this story. This will help us create more engaging stories for you."